welcome to the program. Well, welcome to the program. This is the Health, Wellness, and Lifestyle program with Linda Dorman and Dr. Donna Christensen here on OurTV.network. You can also watch us on Android, Fire Stick, Amazon Fire TV, Android TV, Apple TV, Roku, and you can listen to us on WSTX Radio out of the U.S. Virgin Islands. I am here, it looks like by myself, Dr. Donna Christensen. We hope that she's going to hop on in. But we have here today a very, very, very interesting topic that we're going to talk about with Dr. Shamarka Kiite. We just appreciate that you are here with us. But before we start, I want to make sure that our listeners and our viewers grab a piece of paper and a pencil, maybe a whole notebook, because this is going to be a really interesting topic on biological anthropology, something that we haven't ever discussed on this program, but really we need to get down to the basics of who we are as human beings and really understanding our origins of where we come from. We're going to talk about some very deep subjects with our guest today, who is well versed in this topic. He is, in fact, a biological anthropologist. We're going to define what that means. Has studied at Oxford University, has been a professor at a number of other universities, is currently a medical doctor and former surgeon, currently with St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the District of Columbia, and has just traveled this entire world from Egypt to all kind of places, really taking a look at the academic concepting around biological anthropology. And so I'm sure I'm not doing justice to that, and we're going to give it a good shot here because we've already agreed that we're going to do at least a two-part, maybe even a three-parter. Well, look who's joined us this afternoon.
Yes, I'm sorry I had so much trouble. I was just coming in from the legislature.
Well, we're glad to have you, Dr. Christensen. We couldn't do this program without you.
I'm so excited about our guest today.
Yes, we're very excited about the guest, and I want to make sure that everybody can hear, so just check your volumes. So let's just hop right in and get started, okay? How are you doing, Dr. Kiite?
I'm fine.
Good. Did I pronounce that correctly? Let's make sure that
Keita.
Keita. That's my southern drawl. The Keita.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's just hop into the conversation, shall we? Because we have a lot to cover in a short period of time, and we want to give you so much airtime. So let's just start with something that's very broad. Like, what is anthropology? Can you give us, the 1, 2, 3s of how we understand that in the lay world?
Well, anthropology is currently basically defined as the study of human beings, and that includes their origins and their variations. And it has various dimensions, whether that includes, and it includes actually biology, culture, language, and other things.
Outstanding. And how deep do we go into that? That's a great understanding. In other words, are there levels and different types of anthropology that we would need to understand?
Well, anthropology has traditionally been divided into 4 subfields. One is biological anthropology, the other is linguistic anthropology, there's social anthropology, and there's another area called archaeology, which means different things in different places. And there's another area that basically you could call a 5th subfield, and it's applied anthropology, where you apply to real world problems the insights and data from academic anthropology.
Wow.
And related fields.
Now,
I've always been really interested in anthropology, especially the medical and the biological. And so this is going to be very fascinating discussion.
Yes, ma'am. And it's good to see you. I met you a very long time ago. You wouldn't remember me. It was just at one of those health quality forums or whatever, or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Long time.
Well, we're going to have to get you two connected because Dr. Christensen said, had she not gone into family practice and done remarkable work in her fields, also in politics, she would have gone into medical anthropology, which is different from biological anthropology. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Medical anthropology seeks to understand aspects of health and well-being by integrating those other sub areas, specifically the social and the biological into understanding real world disease problems.
And it sounds like that's where you sit.
Not really. I'm more of an individual who is split. If you really want to know my basic bio, I'm a physician and a biological anthropologist, but my biological anthropology comes more out of the anatomical side of the tradition. So many of the early anthropologists and biological anthropologists actually were physicians first and or natural historians. I mean, when you go way back, it depends on when you want to set the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, how do we set the beginning? That because we talk about the beginning, evolution. We talked about the beginning, with the Big Bang Theory. It's hard to understand, from your perspective, how is there a concept of setting the beginning?
No, well, in that case, I simply meant the beginning of the field,
Oh, okay.
of the academic field, not so much the beginning of life or anything like that.
Of
Or
human
beings, yes.
Yes. Well, let's now kind of talk a little bit about, some of these comparisons. You had talked about the fact that anthropology really looks at a couple of different things: the human groups and the differences, the social customs, possibly disease susceptibility, educational outcomes. How do we start to understand this from the biological anthropology perspective?
Okay, well, anthropology in general, I mean, the as a field studies those variations. Biological anthropology itself, when has its own sub areas. They include things like paleoanthropology, which studies the origins of people, bioarchaeology, which may look at skeletons from various archaeological digs, or graveyards like the African Burial Ground in New York. Okay, bioarchaeology may include looking at remains from museums. Basically, that's comparative. Other areas within biological anthropology would also include primatology, which is the study of non-human primates, and maybe to get a grasp on what we may see as basic human behavior. So when people talk about grooming or the alpha male and whatever, those some of those insights or ideas come from primatology, studying our relatives. And then you have the biological anthropologists who are actually trained in molecular genetics, and they basically do comparisons between populations. Instead of using skulls and skeletons like I do, they look at molecular biology to do that. And then there are little spin-off sub areas in these. Some people specialize in teeth, some people specialize in bones, and some people are interested in biomechanics, how we walk, how we move. So in a way, anthropology that is a way of looking at data. Okay.
Okay. And but the data is coming from the human beings or the primates in other case.
Exactly.
So we're
or the primates, yes.
Oh, the primates. So we're extracting information that helps us to better understand what are we actually studying? Okay, so we understand that we're looking at bones, we're looking at disease states, we're looking at molecular level, at the cellular level, we're looking at animals, primates. What are we gaining from that information?
Well, the driving question in all of that is actually a question that European Enlightenment scientists had about who we are. Who are we?
Yeah.
And that's really what they were doing. And so when European anthropology or when natural history developed, some of the driving questions when they were going around the world, they were really, even though they were describing other people, they were actually really trying to answer some questions about themselves, if I could sum that up. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's really what's driving underneath a lot of this. A lot of these data that were uncovered were origins questions. Okay, and that's the big picture. In other words, evolution is the underlying theoretical framework, but then there are smaller pieces of that, individual things. Another branch of biological anthropology that you know about is forensic anthropology. So hey, there's a murder, or there's an old you come across a grave, unmarked graves, and then you look in the graves and you find out that there are bullets in the skeleton.
Mhm.
Say, wow, maybe this is an unrecorded murder, or missing persons. So forensic people get involved in identification, and of course that includes determining things like the sex from the skeleton, the age from the skeleton, the ancestry, quote unquote, from the skeleton. Mhm.
I've always been, this is where if I were going to be an anthropologist, that one subject right there, the forensic anthropology, that, because I'm thinking, how do we know this? How do we know that it's female, male from the skeletal? How do we know that the age of the skeleton, of the person, just how do we know the ethnicity of that person? Those are the kind of things that are interesting, particularly as we think about origins and how people have traveled and migrated from one country to the next, one region to the next. And what does that mean for us in terms of where we are today? Kind of boiling down. What do you think, Dr. Christensen? Are we exciting you still? Is this something that you?
Yes, but I didn't quite finish the paper that you shared with me, but I'm really interested to hear how the biological anthropologist in Dr. Keita
Yes, ma'am.
merges with the physician, and how what is that telling us?
Well, the overlap between medicine and biological anthropology has a long history, basically via anatomy, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and but also pediatrics. So, for example, the growth standards as determined from skeletal, you remember when we were in school and you learned about looking at skeletal age based on x-rays.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those things were actually developed by anthropologists who were just trying to develop basic science, and that got absorbed into medicine. Uh, Another contribution, I would say, whether acknowledged or not, is the whole idea of variation, that we must have variation. When you were in school and when I was in school a few years after you, you remember the 70-kilogram male in the physiology books? Oh, well,
Yeah.
70-kilogram Nordic male. That was a 70-kilogram Northern European male, thought to be a standard for human beings. Well,
Mm-hmm.
of course, anthropologists intervened with their concepts of variation, or it's soaked in, such that now the NIH says, well, we need to study many population groups. We need to study women, in some cases study children. Now, of course, you can overdo this because there's a certain core of us that is human, but then there are variations that may be of interest, and these may be of clinical interest. What we cannot do, and you ask about the physician in me and the anthropologist, the thing that I know as an anthropologist that informs my practice as a physician is that you must always treat the individual based on that symptom complex and never treat them as the average of a group. You
Right.
have to avoid that just because you have public health data that says so and so demographic tends to have multiple sclerosis or has this or has that, you cannot use that information for any one individual. You still have to do your work. Yet you and I both know, we all know, that a part of the problem in medicine today in terms of bias is the use of the average,
Right.
which is a form of categorical or typological thinking, a use of the average to determine what an individual has. And because of that kind of stereotyping, mistakes get made, both at the policy level and at the individual level in the office.
That's true.
That also be true at the development of pharmaceuticals, as an example, because we know in the African
Trials.
community that we have a really difficult time showing up in trials. And you mentioned that biological anthropology looks at the comparisons of different types of groups. But if we're not showing up in things like clinical trials, then that generalization will occur and we will, be at a disadvantage medically.
Yeah. The sharp way to think about that is to say that when you look at population comparisons and you see differences, that should just alert your antenna to be aware that there may be such differences. So if somebody tells you that their albuterol inhaler is not working, you don't dismiss them and say, oh, that can't be true because the albuterol works for everybody the same way because of its mechanism on vasodilation, et cetera, on pulmonary vasculature and airways.
Mhm.
That may be generally true, but there are individuals, and sometimes they may be more frequent in certain populations than others, for whom the effectiveness is not as good. However, you never use it in the reverse. You never say that, oh, because there are some individuals based on statistics for whom this medicine does not work, then we won't give it to anybody. And Dr. Christensen will remember when there were debates about lisinopril,
Vital.
ACE inhibitors,
Hmm.
about ACE inhibitors specifically.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bideal, but I actually testified against using. I testified against the in the trials at NIH about Bideal and the way it was being characterized. Because the thing is that it's one thing to say that a certain type of physiology is more prominent in a particular group uh, than another. It's another thing to then use that group's name as a definer of that medication. You can't do that. And I actually wrote a piece about that, believe it or not, and in an anthropology location to point out that, Bideal is treating a particular physiological profile that can be found more prevalently, maybe in some groups, but some of those groups include people who are alcoholics or whatever of any particular ancestry or ancestry group. So Bideal is treating a physiological profile. It's not treating an ethnic label.
Right.
Okay.
And just Linda, Vital, are you familiar with it? It was just a drug that had been tested. They found it wasn't, look, the initial research showed that it wasn't effective for congestive heart failure. And then they went back and looked and found that the Black cohort was really responding well to that medication. And so it became a racialized kind of medication.
Yeah, it got.
I remember the conversation with Dr. Underwood. We talked about
Yes.
some of this, yes, on one of our previous shows, and the impact of developing drugs that are more predisposed to support and treat and have success among different groups. And there's, obviously debate on ethnic versus race and whether race is really an existence of something or not. And therefore, how do we treat that in our clinical trials? How do we develop pharmaceuticals and treatment plans? But then also, for both of you in the medical field and Dr. Kita in the anthropology field, I often wonder things like sickle cell anemia. I often wonder things like, why are we having this predisposed for child and maternal health morbidities? What are we learning about that in terms of looking at other groups? Here in America, we have these issues in comparison to places like in Kenya. Do they have these issues? And the anthropologist in you, what would you say are those comparison differences and the potentials of why?
Well, the first thing that modern critical anthropology tells me is be careful. We have to be careful about how we talk about things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So sickle cell anemia is a sickle cell as a mutation is something that emerged a long time ago. It became prevalent in places where there is malaria. Now, did it spread? Did people migrate to some other places? Yes, it probably arose in Africa. That's the most common place. But you can find it in places like Sicily and Greece and the Aegean and a few other places as well. It reaches, though, its frequencies based on the insult, the level of malaria in the environment. Okay, so there are places in Greece that have a higher frequency of the sickle cell gene than places in infra-Saharan Africa. Okay, so you have to be careful about how we characterize and how we talk about things. That is the critical anthropologist in me. And I'll be honest with you, that irritates some people sometimes because they want simple, they want to talk about things in a particular way, and again, talk about it in a categorical kind of way, whereby you convert a probability into an absolute, and that is not what you want to do. So there are people in America of Sicilian origin and other places who have sickle cell anemia too. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. And the ultimate origin of that sickle cell anemia, now this is where it gets interesting, and this is part of my interest. That sickle cell gene did come from Africa, but the question is, how long ago did it come from Africa? I mean, that's another, and that's an academic question. That's not going to help you treat anybody with sickle cell anemia. It's an academic question. It may be of interest in certain types of debates about the nature of human populations in existence and interconnections, but it's not going to help you treat the disease.
But you know, just speaking of that disease, and there's probably many diseases that we can talk about in the context of biological anthropology and those comparisons. And I appreciate your distinction around don't prescribe for one group something for another, and be careful about that. Because when I think about the fact that those who are African American who have sickle cell and enter into the hospitals complaining of the extreme pain that they're in or needing the time off from work, they're often just simply not believed. We've had some shows where we've topics where we've talked about the dynamics of sickle cell as an example, as compared to non-melanated people in the world, those from Greece or Italy, as you've mentioned, and descent. It can be very challenging when we think about those nuances in terms of treatment.
Yes, let me just say something very quickly about that. Don't forget, I mean, this is actually more relevant than you may realize. In 1991, an article was published in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, about people going to emergency rooms in California, and the diagnosis of sickle cell anemia was missed because these were Latinos, and these were stereotypical Mexicans, stereotypically looking Latinos, dark skin, but not necessarily quote unquote black or straight hair, but they have African ancestry as well. And so this diagnosis was being missed. Why? Because they didn't think about it. Why? Because they didn't know the history of Central America. Okay. And the people themselves did not have in their family memories any quote black people that they remember. Right. Because it's 400 years old, it's 300 years old, it's 200 years old. Okay.
That's just so fascinating.
But the same thing could happen to a Sicilian. The same thing could happen to a Sicilian or a Greek person going into the emergency room, belly pain, and you assume it's this or that. You examine them, they've got a big spleen. Think about a child, and people say, "Oh, well, why?" And they do every test in the book except the sickle cell test until somebody smart comes along and says, "Oh, they've got a Greek name. Let's do a sickle cell test." That's your answer right there.
But don't you need to have someone that has at least some sensitivity to that biological anthropology, the study thereof, to even have that top of mind? Is that?
Well, yeah. Well, this is where the contribution of understanding human variation, as it has flowed into medicine, that's what it is. So it is the information about this variation in anthropology, although it was a physician who discovered sickle cell anemia. It's the information about it that flows into general practice, as it will, to general knowledge to be used. But people have to think of it. They have to remember to think of it,
My goodness. Well, we have just a few seconds left in the first half of the program, because when we come back from the commercial break, we want to talk about the fetal programming, something very specific that I know that you have written on and have lectured on, among many, many topics, that I think in today's, how do we start to think about it at the individual level and at the personal response level? So when we come back from the commercial break, we will hop into that conversation. And so thank you so much for this sterling first segment of Health, Wellness, and Lifestyle with Linda Dorman and Dr. Donna Christensen here on Amazon Fire TV, Android TV, Apple TV, Roku, OurTV.network, and WSTX Bloomberg Radio. We'll be right back.
Having an issue with your bank? What? Did your credit card company close your account without warning? Did an online merchant refuse to send your purchase after they took your money? Know your rights as a consumer. Here's what you can do to file a complaint. As soon as you're aware of a problem, contact the customer service staff at your financial institution or merchant to make them aware of the issue. This is typically the fastest way to resolve your complaint. If that doesn't resolve the problem, you should reach out to the appropriate regulatory agency to file a complaint. The Federal Reserve Consumer Help Center experts and website can answer your questions about how to file a complaint against a bank or other institution. The FRCH website can also help you find the regulator for your financial institution. Depending on the type of institution you have a complaint against, the agency will differ. For complaints about federally insured state chartered bank members of the Federal Reserve System, contact federalreserveconsumerhelp.gov. Specialists can direct you to the agency that regulates your institution, such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Housing Finance Agency. The National Credit Union Administration would get complaints about credit unions. And for complaints about an online merchant, contact the Federal Trade Commission. The list of regulated entities these federal agencies oversee is also available at federalreserve.gov/consumercommunities/agency. For more information about how to file a consumer complaint, please visit the link in this post.
For 10 years, the Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making has tracked the economic well-being and financial conditions reported by U.S. adults and their families. The survey collects data on how people feel about their family's finances to help understand the effects of broader economic trends over time. Conducted in October 2022, the latest survey reveals that 73% of adults were doing at least okay financially, meaning they reported either doing okay or living comfortably. The share of adults doing at least okay financially in 2022 was down 5 percentage points from 2021 and was among the lowest observed since 2016. This decline in well-being aligns with broader economic conditions during fall 2022, including inflation and stock market declines. In economically challenging times, relatively small, unexpected expenses such as a car repair or a modest medical bill can be a hardship for many families. When faced with a hypothetical expense of $400, 63% of all adults in 2022 said they would have covered it exclusively using cash, savings, or a credit card paid off at the next statement, referred to altogether as cash or its equivalent. The share who would pay using cash or its equivalent was down 5 percentage points from 2021 and back at its 2019 level. Consistent with widespread experience of higher prices in the prior year, most adults said that price increases had affected their family budget. Adults with incomes under $100,000 were more likely to say their family budget was affected a lot by rising prices, compared to adults with higher incomes. Black and Hispanic adults, parents living with children under 18, and those with a disability were also more likely to indicate that their budget had been affected a lot by higher prices. Most people took action in response to higher prices, especially through changing spending. The most common adjustments were using less or stopping using products, as well as switching to cheaper alternatives. Just above 1/2 of respondents reduced savings. Increasing borrowing, working more, and asking for a raise were less common strategies. These survey findings provide insight into the wide range of financial opportunities and challenges facing U.S. families at the time of the survey. More information is available in the report on the economic well-being of U.S. households in 2022. To view or download this year's full report and downloadable survey data, visit federalreserve.gov/consumerscommunities/shed.
Well, welcome back. We're all kind of reassembling right here on the Health, Wellness, and Lifestyle program with Linda Dorman and Dr. Donna Christensen. We have with us Shamarka Keita, Dr. Shamarka Keita. We're talking about the subject of biological anthropology. We've had a very, very, very sterling first segment, and now we're going to have an even more interesting second half. And so we encourage our listeners to and our viewers to get your pens and your paper, really take some notes, and then just really start to Google and understand this important field of study as it relates to anthropology. So welcome back. Is everything okay, Dr. Christensen? You're good? Oh, she's going to hop back in. She's broadcasting from the United States Virgin Islands, and sometimes they go in, sometimes they go out.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
The moment. This is what live TV is all about. So let's talk
Sorry,
about.
I had
Here
no
she is.
sound.
We're glad
I'm
that you're
so
back.
much interested in this. Yes,
Thank you. Thank you.
I feel like you're our main audience because you were so interested in this particular field, and
Yeah.
and I appreciate that.
Especially after, because as Dr. Keita knows, this is an issue around health equity and health disparities. And we're finding out so many new things about why African Americans and people who have lived in marginalized lives are sicker than everybody else. So yeah.
Yes.
And that's what the heart of trying to understand this thing called biological anthropology and its intersection and its integration, if you will, into the medical fields, but more so as an individual person. How can I appreciate it and not think of it as just a study of bones somewhere in antiquity, and you've done that too. You have studied, Dr. Keita, you have studied bones, and you have studied cultures and societies and all kinds of interesting things in Egypt, all the way from Egypt to New York, like you said. It's pretty intense. So why don't we talk about something that is getting a lot of attention with a lot of different subjects on these days, and that is the concept of fetal programming. Let's just use it as a broad. What is fetal programming? Let's talk about that first.
Okay. I want to preface my remark by saying that some biological anthropologists have written specifically about the biology of poverty. Okay. Now, like I said, there is a field called biological anthropology, and there are people who get doctorates in it, like me. But there are also people that do biological anthropology from one point of view as a perspective on how to handle data. And they may not have been trained formally in anthropology, but they're working like anthropologists. I just want to say that, just to say it. So now,
you're the real deal. Let's just break it down. You're the real deal.
No. What I'm just trying to say is that you can think of things as in terms of a perspective. You can use those tools without necessarily having been formally trained in a particular way. That's just a comment. That's
okay.
I'm just
context, providing important. A little extra context. So
yes. So but think about because what you're talking about is the biology. When you talk about health inequalities, oftentimes or usually you're talking about the biology of a difference rooted in extreme social disadvantage or historical disadvantage. You're not just talking about comparing two groups of, as an example, middle-class people, one of whom ate their veggies and the other just ate steak. Now you could do that and you will see a difference there. Okay. You will see a difference between people within the same social class, same background, you can find a difference. Okay. But now when you find whole population differences where you can't make a simple comparison, then you have to delve into the historical, you have to delve into the evolutionary, you have to delve into other factors. At least this has been found. So now let's talk about fetal programming. Is just a term to describe the likely mechanism or one of the mechanisms for disease in adults. Okay. In other words, saying that it's been noted that cardiovascular disease can be associated with certain prenatal experiences. Okay. And other things. So this is where, so we talked about fetal programming as the mechanism, but you can find books with and articles with the title "The Developmental Origins of health and disease, developmental origins. You're developing in the womb. Okay. Now, this was triggered in large part by something called the Dutch famine study, which I think Dr. Christian probably knows far more about than I do. But it was noticed, well, it was noticed in the 70s that in certain cities in Holland, that there was a spike in increase in various metabolic diseases, but also psychiatric illness and some other things. And then they said, why do we have this spike in these locations? So they went and they looked back and they found out that all of these people, or in general, the cities where this was occurring, because people don't always move around a lot in some European cities, these were cities where the Nazis had blockaded the food sources in World War II, so that these women who were pregnant at that time got a caloric restriction of 800 calories a day or something. So these are their children 40 years later, 30 years later, developing a greater frequency of metabolic diseases. So this is what sparked the idea that there could be a developmental origin. And then it's been gone on, and there's experimental stuff now. And there's some debate about its total relevance. Okay, but the idea is that the fetus programs itself in such a severe environment to survive.
Wow.
Now, I'm not thinking to do this, but these are physiological mechanisms, cellular level mechanisms kicking in, so the fetus gets to come to term. So it's a kind of adaptation. But in doing that adaptation, it sets them up for diseases later in life. That's an incredible thing to think about.
It
Now,
is.
think about populations, and it also affects cognition. Poverty has been shown to affect executive function, cognitive abilities, reading, etc. Severe disadvantage. This is all part of, without getting technical, related to the endocrine axis, the endocrine things as they work on the developing brain. Okay,
Right.
so this is all relevant. Yeah, endocrine things. You get compromised that way, and so deep disadvantage, not just because your mother didn't read to you, but also because there's an underlying biological basis. Some people would want to accuse people who study these things of being racist. Oh, they're saying that this trauma. No, this is all environment.
Yeah.
You study it to understand it. So then people like Dr. Christensen can go to Congress and say, look, we don't need money to study, how we can build another nuclear weapon. We've got plenty. We need money to study how we can mitigate the effects that poverty has had on pregnant women and children. Okay. And that's going to cost a lot more money maybe than that nuclear weapon, which is why those who know about this, now I'm being conspiratorial, have not put the money into it. Because if I know about this, many other people know about it. I mean, what I'm saying, this is in the literature now. There's a video that I would recommend to your audience and to you called Unnatural Causes.
Unnatural causes.
Unnatural Causes. And what it does is it goes through numerous case studies of how the environment has impacted people's health. That the only explanation is to say the environment, and sometimes the invisible environment, has affected people. You may be familiar with the Whitehall study. And the Whitehall study was done in England against English people, English people looking at social class. Only social class, Dr. Christensen. And it was determined basically that wealth tracks with health.
Absolutely. And there have been many other studies that have shown that.
Exactly. But let me
go ahead. Let me let you
finish. What I
finish.
just wanted to say is that, but I want to put that in a sort of stark relief too. We may understand that generally in terms of access, but we can also understand, but part of the factors have to do with your sense of control over your life. So the blue collar worker in England who works in the mines, who has maybe lots of exposures, but let's say he or she works in an office, smokes 2 packs a day, has a national health care system, socialized medicine, right? That person who smokes 2 packs a day is more likely to be ill from that smoking, in whatever sense you want, than the millionaire, the person who makes £1 million in England, who's upper class. And what they're saying, and they discovered this, and then they discovered in the Whitehall study that even people within the upper class or the upper middle class, that there were gradations even within that it wasn't just a cut point phenomenon. So what would explain this? Because when they do all the regression, all the fancy statistics, it turns out that no, it's not just, do you have good health care? It's not just your diet. It's not just all of the obvious critters. There's something else that's going on. And maybe it has to do with that you have less stress if you make £1 million a year. And so you're less vigilant. So your endocrine system is not turned on all the time. Whereas your blue collar person, even if you've got a job and what have you, you're more stressed. And so these are other factors that we have to talk about in terms of health. And I haven't said anything about toxic environments laid on top of it.
Later on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it goes to something that has always been troubled me, that we get blamed. Poor people, Black people, brown people, Native American people get blamed for the illnesses that we suffer from,
Right.
as though we are cause.
Yes.
Now we're seeing that there's so many factors, either in the womb. And we did a session after Hillary did her early childhood brain development summit. We did one looking at in poor communities and in minority communities. And I think there were some brain differences even as a child was being born. But right after that point in time, you mentioned the brain growth. There's a lot that has to happen in those first couple of years that sometimes the normal stresses of life do not allow to happen.
Yes.
And then you end up with behavioral problems, learning disabilities, and all kinds of things that also contribute to maybe not taking good care of yourself and being sick later on.
Right.
So
A lot of work we need to do on all of that.
it's almost shocking. It's almost frightening to think about it from the layperson as I'm hearing this, that if I'm a woman who is birthing a child, and that child happens to be, and I have all the eggs that I'm starting out with as when I was born, my female child is being developed and has all those eggs that child is going to then birth more children from. Are you saying that somewhere in that continuum that there is this mutation or this change based on environmental, based on a number of individual factors from mother to child to grandchild to great-grandchild scenario?
Okay, now I haven't said anything about mutation, and what you're alluding to is something that I think you and I have talked about before. I was just simply pointing out that a woman carrying a female child is also carrying the eggs that will form the grandchild. Okay, yeah. And so if that woman carrying the female fetus is in herself next to a toxic dump, add that toxic dump, number one. Number two, add the stress of racism, number two. Number three, add the stress of poverty on top of that. Number four, add epigenetics, which I haven't talked about, from great-great-grandparents, from slavery, changes that may have occurred, and all, and then you have a very complex situation that few people have talked about as a possible contributor to health inequities.
Mm-hmm.
And also in terms of even just plain old basic human biology. How is it that Serena Williams has trouble delivering a child? How is it that a bronze medalist who's perfectly healthy? Look at unnatural causes. Look at unnatural causes, because they go through some cases like that where they've got African-American woman who's got a great husband, a White House and a picket fence, lives in the suburbs, great health care, great job, great everything, and her pregnancy is troubled. Well, I speculate that when we get the molecular tools to understand this, that we'll find something that has to do with the prenatal environment and even the transgenerational environment. Okay. And what we have to do is and this is why doctors who are in Congress, like you, Dr. Christensen, or were in Congress, you're very important to bring up looking at this kind of research to mitigate it. We can't change what happened 2 generations ago. What we need to do is they ask the question, is there a way to mitigate alterations in protein and gene expression, if that's the issue? Is there a way to counter what mechanisms may be incompletely described in fetal programming? Is there a way to counter this? Also, Arlene Geronimus's book.
Yes, I use that all the time.
Yeah, well, her new book, Weathering, speaks to the fact of how poor people, other people under extreme regimes have been affected again by the external environment. It weathers them, it ages them and weathers them and affects their biology. And she's really talking about postnatally. I've been talking about prenatally. So, but then the postnatal can affect the prenatal if you've got a woman. That's why the healthcare of pregnant women and children is an ethical issue for me.
Yes.
Now, that's not medical, that's spiritual for me. But it is medical too, don't get me wrong. But I'm just saying
and Geronimus makes the point too that because it's a gender and racial trauma that makes women so much more vulnerable. And I've only started at birth, but I always said it's been our life experiences that long before we get to be pregnant and in the delivery room that is causing this problem. And now you're taking it even a step further back.
Yes.
Into the womb.
Yes.
So we have a lot of
research. Well, then this is such a critical conversation, and I hope that you'll already accept our invitation. I know you did because I asked you, but I want to just publicly put it out there that you would have to come back at least 2 or 3 more times. And, to really have a full panel that circles this entire issue from that biological anthropologist standpoint, all the way to that policy, as well as the medical, and have a very robust conversation, because the challenge with child and maternal health morbidity is just staggering. And you are absolutely spot on to challenge our thinking. Why would a Serena Williams, who is wealthy and could have the best of every healthcare, suffering from a child maternity issue, versus the woman who is, blue collar and on subsidies, and to have the same kind of incidence? Is there something that we need to better understand in how we do treat ourselves? But we need to do it now, so our children, our young girls, can be cocooned in such a way that when they become mothers, we can begin to mitigate this further down the generational line. Yeah, because you're right. Can't regret what's going on from the past. We can't, even those of us who are adults now, who are past child rearing years, or, we're right at the threshold of it. We have to better understand, and how do we work with our young people who are producing the generations of the future?
Yes.
Policies and
but remember, there are some things that have been unanswered. We need to understand. I'm going to talk about this in a magical kind of way. Okay. If we could have a pill that could reverse the effects at the cellular level of whatever fetal programming does, and we don't know what it does, and reverse epigenetics, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting.
Yeah. I just say that a black box of a pill to fix that stuff, but what we need is the research. Mm-hmm. We need to tell people, avoid stress if you can. We need to get stress out of our neighborhoods. We need to get good nutrition, all of that stuff. And even when we do all of those things,
right,
it still can't erase some of what I was talking about. But it can help dent it. And that's the whole point. And that's the whole point. Let's not just talk about America. Let's think about, what is the human potential that has been lost when we have an Ethiopian famine that goes on 10 years,
Right.
or a Sahel Belt famine in the mid 70s, when I was there, by the way, in Mali.
Or homelessness throughout the United States, where it's not just one person or an adult who's fallen, it's families.
But I'm looking at the whole diasporic, where I'm looking at a larger picture.
Yes.
And there are some interesting things, though, that we can say right now. And this is the public health anthropology thing. And I know Dr. Christensen is going to smile at this before I say it. Infant mortality in America is worse than it is in Cuba.
It is. It's worse than, and maternal mortality also worse than some countries I never even heard of.
I got you. Exactly. So then let me do the ethnic thing or the ancestral thing. So African American women, Afro North American women of trafficked African descent or Middle Passage descent have poorer outcomes than Afro-Cuban women who are also descendants of trafficked Africans reduced to the status of slavery. I have my own vocabulary. We can talk about that another day.
I hear you. So you're saying that all of us came over on taken from our home in Africa, brought over on ships, but
and reduced to slavery.
In Cuba,
somehow
they have a much better outcome than we have in the United States.
And I don't know exactly why, because racism existed in Cuba. Slavery was ended in Cuba in 1888. Maybe slavery in Cuba was different than here. Maybe the stresses of life were different. See, that's a topic for, it could be a sociologist, an anthropologist, an ethnologist.
Everybody
to study, to drill down, to understand what are these things. Because of course, the partisans of the Cuban Revolution will say, it's because of Fidel, it's because of the revolution. I don't think it's quite that simple. But I understand why they would say it, but it's not quite that simple.
So then let's think about this. Let's leave our audience with some homework, some things to really think about. That if we know that this subject of child and maternal health we haven't associated it, we haven't thought about it as fetal programming issues. We need, and how we are programming that fetus, both fetus in the future and our grandchildren, the next generations, particularly if you're a female child. What should we leave our audience with in terms of what can they do now to help mitigate?
Okay. Now, all of the basic things that the doctors tell you are things that would help mitigate or stop those types of mechanisms from going into play, if you have the means to do it. So getting your prenatal vitamins, eating well, sleeping well, avoiding lots of stress.
Yes.
That takes care of what the development
that's hard to do
have going on now.
But is it
epigenetic?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But isn't it also part of the homework we want to leave our audience with in just a couple of minutes, is really understanding backwards. You need to have that history, your genealogy, your family history. This is why it's really important to have that information, is that so that you can impact on what happens in the future. Have that as your family medical history in particular.
Having your family medical history will help with very specific things. With this larger biological phenomenon I'm talking about, it may not help with that. Okay.
And stress is very hard to control because it's coming at you.
Exactly.
From outside. It's developing the kind of coping mechanisms. I've come to think of our famous resilience as being harmful, really, because we're not facing the problem that's coming at us. We're kind of just internalizing it and moving on. And I don't think that's healthy either.
Well, I would like to say in that regard, I know we've got to go. Isn't it interesting that we have a kind of what we would call a bimodal curve? We like to talk about all of these African Americans, even the ones from Tulsa, who survived Greenwood. They're 103 years old. But then we have these other statistics about infant mortality, our increased waste, in other words, our increased death. So we've got two things.
Premature death.
Our premature death, yes.
So this is what we're going to do.
So the point is that
Mhm.
it's interesting. We've got these two things going on. So what is special about these people who live to be 100 through the same conditions, same mothers and fathers? That's another kind of research question. It's the kind of question that we would ask, and it's not necessarily being asked on our population. There are people who study old people. I mean, there are all these guys who run around all over the world and they study.
Well,
elderly people.
let me just give you, because that I just want to make sure that I connect Dr. Christensen and Dr. Keita. You two are going to have more conversation after this, and then we're going to bring you back, and we're going to bring some others back to continue this conversation, because it's really important that, particularly as African Americans, we understand where we are, and how we do that is to have the broader context of where we have been biologically. So biological anthropologists, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming
But
on,
also our the environment, because you
and
can
the environment.
mitigate a lot of your biology, or at least once we know what we have to do.
Exactly.
Well, let's plan
lessen the
let's plan
effect.
on the part 2. We have to go and let our next program start. But this has been the Health, Wellness, and Lifestyle program with Linda Dorman and Dr. Donna Christensen, and here on OurTV.network with Dr. Shamarka Keita. Thank you so very much.